Welcome back to another episode of The Art of Negotiation. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on valuable insights, strategies, and tips to master the art of negotiation. You can share thoughts and feedback in the comment box.
Welcome to your deep dive on building trust in negotiation. We're going to unpack some seriously insightful stuff from the Negotiation Skills Academy. This deep dive will get you ready to create those win-win situations, and you're going to learn some pretty interesting points about what information you shouldn't be sharing when you're negotiating.
Absolutely. Trust is truly the bedrock of successful negotiation. We're going to explore how to use that trust to foster cooperation, establish credibility, and navigate those moments where you're not quite sure how much you should reveal.
So this article starts off with this scenario, and I think we've all been there, where you're trying to negotiate with someone who is just not giving up any information about their sources. It really highlights how quickly things can stall out if you don't have that very basic level of trust.
It's a great example. It really shows how trust isn't just this sort of feel-good factor. It's a strategic tool that can actually directly impact how your negotiation plays out. You can think of it this way. Without trust, you're essentially trying to build a house on sand.
That's such a great analogy. Okay, let's get into some of the specific tips. The first one they highlight is open and honest communication. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? But I have a feeling there's a little bit more to it than meets the eye.
There definitely is. They talk about being really upfront about what information you need and why you need it. But here's where things get really interesting. They actually outline the types of information that you really should not disclose. Things like confidential business strategies, your financial data, even personal opinions, and sensitive market research.
Wow, okay, that's a curveball I was not expecting.
Yeah.
So it's not just about being open, it's also about being strategic about protecting your own interests.
Exactly. Transparency is really powerful, but you also need to be mindful of your competitive edge. It's about finding that sweet spot. How can you be open enough to build rapport, but not actually compromise your position?
So how do you strike that balance? Do you have any tips for how we can figure out what we should share and what we should maybe keep under wraps?
It's a judgment call. It really depends on the specific negotiation that you're in. One thing that I always recommend is to ask yourself this question. If the other party knew this information, would it change their perception of my value or my willingness to negotiate? If the answer to that question is yes, then it might be something you want to keep a little closer to the vest.
That is really helpful advice. I'm already starting to think about how much more strategic I could be with the information I share.
It's a game changer. And speaking of strategy, the article goes on to talk about how you can actually use objective criteria to build trust. Things like market valuations, industry standards, basically, anything that kind of takes the negotiation out of the realm of, well, this is just my opinion, and puts it on more solid ground.
I see where they're going with that. It's like having a neutral referee, right? So you can both feel confident that the negotiation is actually fair and it's grounded in something concrete.
Exactly. That sense of fairness is so important to building trust. When you can point to objective data to support your position, it makes it a lot harder for the other side to dismiss your arguments as just, your personal preference.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, okay, we've got open and honest communication, strategic information sharing, using objective criteria. What's next?
Well, the next one might seem pretty basic, but it's one that's often overlooked, and that is active listening. I think we all know how important it is to listen, but it's more than just hearing words, right? It's about really making an effort to understand where the other party is coming from. What are their concerns? What are their motivations? Maybe even their underlying anxieties about this negotiation.
So it's about demonstrating empathy, not just going through the motions of listening. I can definitely see how that could build rapport. Any advice for becoming a better active listener?
One simple but powerful technique is just reflecting back what you've heard. Instead of saying like, oh yeah, I understand, try to actually summarize what they said in your own words.
Yeah.
It shows that you're not just passively listening, you're actually processing and engaging with what they're saying.
That's a great tip. I'm going to start practicing that one right away. I have a feeling it'll make a big difference in how people perceive me in these negotiations.
I think you'll be surprised. Now, building on the idea of active listening, the article also talks about keeping your emotions in check during the negotiation. This is one that we can all relate to, right?
Yeah. Negotiations can definitely get heated sometimes. It's easy to let your emotions get the better of you, but I imagine that can really damage trust if you let that happen. So the key takeaway here is to stay calm and focused on the goal, even if things start to get a little tense.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Every time you have like an emotional outburst, it's like a crack in the foundation of trust that you're trying to build. You want to create a sense of stability, professionalism, not, drama and chaos.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of stability, I bet consistency plays a big role in trust building too. Nobody trusts someone who's flaky or who doesn't follow through on their promises.
Absolutely right. Reliability is essential. It shows that your words have weight and that you're someone who can be counted on. Think about it. The people you trust the most in your own life, they're the ones who are consistently dependable.
That's so true. Okay, so we've covered open communication, strategic information sharing, using objective criteria, active listening, keeping our emotions in check, and being consistent. Is there anything else?
Yeah, there are a couple more. One is this idea of mutual dependence. The idea that when both parties actually recognize that they need each other to achieve their goals, it can actually foster trust.
That's really interesting. I never thought of it that way. Can you unpack that a little more for us?
Think of it like a partnership where both parties are bringing something valuable to the table. When you recognize that you actually need their expertise, their resources, or even just their cooperation, you're much more likely to actually trust them and work with them.
So it shifts that mindset from us versus them to we're both in this together. It's about recognizing that you're on the same team, even if you have different goals.
Exactly. That shared purpose can be a really powerful foundation for trust. It really encourages transparency, open communication, and a willingness to compromise because you're both working towards something bigger than yourselves.
I'm really starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's not just about, isolated tips and tricks. It's about creating this whole environment of trust and collaboration.
That's such a great insight.
Yeah.
And building on that, the next tip in the article is about explicitly calling out the concessions that you're making in the negotiation.
What do you mean by that?
Well, actually saying things like, look, I'm willing to move on this point because I know it's important to you. Or I'm making this concession because I want to show you that I'm really serious about reaching a deal that works for both of us.
So it's about being transparent about the compromises that you're making, highlighting the fact that you're actually willing to give something up in order to reach, a mutually beneficial agreement.
Exactly. It's a really subtle but powerful way to build trust and demonstrate good faith.
Mm.
It shows that you're not just trying to get everything that you want. You're actually invested in finding a solution that benefits everyone.
That is a very smart strategy. I can see how that could really make a difference, especially in a negotiation that's maybe feeling a little stuck.
Yeah, for sure. And it leads perfectly into the last point the article makes, which is, the importance of collaboration. This is where trust really flourishes. When you have both parties working together towards a win-win outcome, it creates a sense of shared purpose and mutual respect.
So it's not about looking at this negotiation as a battle to be won. It's a problem that you're trying to solve together. Like you're both working on the same puzzle, each bringing your own pieces to the table.
That's a fantastic analogy.
Hmm.
And it really highlights the fact that collaboration isn't about being weak or giving in. It's about leveraging each other's strengths and perspectives to create something better than either of you could have achieved on your own.
Wow, this deep dive is already packed with so many insights, and we've only just scratched the surface. I can't wait to hear more about how we can take these tips and actually start putting them into practice.
I know, it's exciting stuff. In the next part, we're going to delve even deeper into the nuances of building trust, including how to handle those really tricky situations where, trust might be fragile or maybe even broken. So stay tuned. If your organization is keen training your employees on negotiation skills, please feel free to reach us at the contact details mentioned in the description.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork for building trust, but how do we actually create an environment where the other party feels comfortable trusting us? Are there, specific techniques we can use to do that?
There are, and some of them might surprise you. One really effective technique is actually demonstrating vulnerability.
Vulnerability in a negotiation. That seems a little counterintuitive. Wouldn't that make you appear weak or give the other party more leverage?
It might seem that way at first glance, but think about it this way. When you're willing to, let your guard down a little bit, it actually signals that you're not trying to hide anything.
Yeah,
You're being genuine. You're being real.
yeah.
It could be as simple as admitting you don't have all the answers or that you're open to hearing their perspective.
So it's kind of like saying, hey, I'm not perfect, but I'm here to work with you in good faith. I can see how that could be really disarming, especially if the other party is coming in expecting a much more adversarial kind of approach.
Exactly. That honesty can really create a space where both parties feel safe to be themselves. and to share their true needs and interests. It's not about weakness, it's about building a more authentic connection.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we talked earlier about open communication, but is there ever a time when it's okay to hold back information? I'm thinking about situations where revealing certain details might put you at a disadvantage.
That's a great question. And the answer is, it depends. There will be times when certain information is truly confidential or could jeopardize your position. The key is to be strategic about what you withhold and how you handle it.
So how do you do that? How do you keep a secret, so to speak, without seeming suspicious or making it look like you're, trying to hide something? I imagine that can be pretty tricky.
It all comes back to transparency. If you're not able to share certain information, just be upfront about it. Explain why you can't disclose it, but really emphasize that you're still committed to being as open as possible. You're basically saying, I trust you, but I also have a responsibility to protect this information.
That's a great way to frame it. It's about being honest about your limitations while still demonstrating your trustworthiness. And it goes back to that balance we talked about, finding that sweet spot between transparency and, protecting your own interests.
Exactly. It's a bit of a delicate dance, but it's an essential one for, navigating the complexities of these kinds of negotiations. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something that I think often gets overlooked, and that is body language.
I'm all ears. I've always been fascinated by how much we actually communicate without even saying a word. Do you think nonverbal cues can really impact trust in a noticeable way?
Oh, absolutely. Your body language can be incredibly powerful in conveying your intentions and building rapport. When your words and your body language are in alignment, it sends a really strong message of authenticity and trustworthiness.
So things like making eye contact, nodding your head, having an open posture, those can all contribute to building trust.
Exactly. It shows that you're engaged, that you're listening, and that you're approachable. On the other hand, if your body language is contradicting what you're saying, it can actually create suspicion and erode trust really quickly.
So, you could be saying all the right things, but if you're, fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, crossing your arms, it's going to send a really mixed message. It's like you're saying one thing, but feeling something completely different.
Precisely. And people are really attuned to those kinds of inconsistencies. It makes them question your sincerity and, rightly so. So the key takeaway here is just to be mindful of your body language and make sure it's actually aligned with what you're saying and what you actually intend.
It's about being congruent verbally and non-verbally. Now, is it just about what we're doing, or do we also need to pay attention to what the other party's body language is telling us?
That's a great point. Paying attention to their nonverbal cues can give you some really valuable insights into how they're feeling and whether or not they're truly engaged in the negotiation. Are they leaning in, making eye contact, nodding their head, or are they, leaning back, looking away, crossing their arms?
So it's like a constant feedback loop. You're adjusting your behavior based on what you're seeing and feeling from them. You're reading those nonverbal cues to kind of gauge their level of trust and comfort.
Exactly. It's about creating this dynamic where both parties feel seen and heard and respected. And it brings us back to the core of what we're talking about here. Building trust isn't just about saying the right words. It's about creating this whole environment of trust, an environment where both parties feel safe and respected and understood.
It's about more than just tactics and, techniques. It's about fostering genuine connection and understanding. And that takes time and effort.
It absolutely does. Trust isn't built overnight. It's a process.
And it's a process that's worth investing in because, as we've seen, trust is the foundation of any successful negotiation. It unlocks the possibility of collaboration, creativity, and, those win-win outcomes that we're all striving for.
Well said. Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still more to explore. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to tackle those really tricky situations where trust might be a bit more fragile. What happens when there's been a breach of trust? Or when you're dealing with someone who has a reputation for being, difficult?
Those are great questions, and I'm eager to hear your insights. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore how to navigate those challenging situations and come out on top with trust intact. What happens when someone breaks that trust? They break a promise, they miss a deadline, or they just don't follow through on what they said they were going to do. How do you even begin to repair that?
Yeah. It can definitely feel like a setback, but it doesn't have to be the end of the road. The first step is to acknowledge the breach directly. Don't try to sweep it under the rug or pretend it didn't happen.
So it's about addressing the issue head on, but I imagine you have to be really careful about how you do that. You don't want to make the other party defensive or escalate the conflict.
Exactly. And that means approaching the conversation with a focus on understanding, not blame. You want to avoid accusing the other party or getting caught up in this, who's right and who's wrong kind of dynamic. Instead, try to understand why the breach happened.
So it's about having a conversation, not a confrontation. And maybe that involves asking questions like, what happened here? Or can you help me understand why this commitment wasn't met?
Yeah, exactly. And even if you don't necessarily agree with their reasons or, even if you don't feel like they were justified, it's still important to listen with empathy. Try to see things from their perspective, even if it's difficult.
That makes sense. It's about understanding the context, not necessarily condoning the behavior. Okay, but once you've had that conversation, how do you actually start rebuilding trust? I imagine it's not something that happens overnight.
No, it definitely takes time and effort. It's kind of like repairing a broken vase, you know? You have to very carefully put all the pieces back together. And just like with a repaired vase, the relationship might not be quite the same as it was before, but it can still be strong and functional.
Okay, so what are some like concrete steps that you can take to kind of start that repair process?
One really important step is to clearly articulate your expectations moving forward. What needs to happen for you to feel comfortable trusting them again? What are your non-negotiables?
So it's about setting clear boundaries and making sure that those boundaries are respected. It's about drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is what I need in order to move forward.
Exactly. And sometimes putting things in writing can be really helpful. It has a level of formality and accountability that can be reassuring when that trust has been broken.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like saying, okay, we're serious about this. We're both willing to put in the work to rebuild this relationship. But what about those situations where you're dealing with someone who has a reputation for being, difficult or untrustworthy? How do you even approach building trust with someone like that?
That can be a real challenge. But it's not impossible. The key is to manage your expectations and protect yourself while still, leaving a little bit of room for the possibility that trust can be built.
So going in with a healthy dose of skepticism, but not completely shutting down the possibility of a positive outcome.
Exactly. Don't expect them to change their behavior overnight. Instead, focus on small wins. Look for opportunities to collaborate on low-stakes issues where the risks are minimal.
So build trust gradually, one step at a time. It's like testing the waters before you jump in headfirst.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, you always have the power to walk away if you feel like your trust is being violated. You're not obligated to stay in a situation that makes you uncomfortable.
That's a really important reminder. It's about knowing your worth and not compromising your values just to get a deal.
Absolutely. Your integrity and your peace of mind are way more valuable than any agreement. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Trust is a powerful tool, but it's also a delicate one. It takes work. It takes a willingness to be vulnerable and strategic.
We've learned that it's not just about what you say, but how you say it and how you act. It's about creating an environment where trust can flourish. And even when that trust is broken, it's not the end of the story. With open communication, empathy, and a commitment to rebuilding, you can repair those broken connections and move forward.
Trust is the bedrock of any successful negotiation, and it's a journey worth taking. As you head into your next negotiation, remember all the tools and strategies we've discussed. Approach every interaction with authenticity and a genuine desire to create those win-win outcomes. And never underestimate the power of trust to transform not just your negotiations, but all your relationships as well.